Charleston, 1822. A city drenched in wealth, cotton, and cruelty. By day, overseers ruled with whips and iron. By night, their arrogance lulled them into sleep. But one night, a house slave, silent, calculating, and burning with vengeance, lit a single spark that would consume them all. 40 overseers, trapped in their slumber, became victims of a fire that still haunts the records of Charleston's darkest hour. Charleston in the year 1822 was a city of glittering facades and rotting foundations. By daylight, its streets bustled with carriages, merchants, and ladies in silk strolling beneath the swaying palms. The harbor glittered with tall-masted ships, their sails fat with the Atlantic wind, bringing in wealth that would line the pockets of planters and traders. To an outsider, Charleston looked like a jewel of the American South, cultured, refined, prosperous. But beneath the whitewashed houses and cobbled streets, another Charleston stirred. It was a city of shadows, built on backs that bent until they broke. Nearly half the people who lived here were enslaved, men and women whose labor in the rice swamps, the cotton fields, and the kitchens filled the city's treasuries with blood money. They walked the streets with their eyes lowered, hands roughened, bodies marked by the lash. Slavery was not hidden here, it was the very rhythm of Charleston's heart. It dictated who ate and who starved, who slept on feathered beds and who on dirt floors, who lived and who died nameless. And though the city glowed golden in the sunlight, at night it whispered with fear. For in Charleston, 1822 was not just another year. It was the year of Denmark Vesey's conspiracy, a planned uprising that terrified the white population to its core. Vesey, a freedman who had once purchased his liberty, was accused of orchestrating a vast rebellion of enslaved people. The authorities claimed thousands were prepared to rise up, torch the city, and slaughter its masters. Whether the conspiracy was as large as reported or inflated by panic, one fact was undeniable: Charleston was trembling. Overseers, those hired men who ruled the plantations with whip and pistol, tightened their grip. Their cruelty sharpened like a blade. Where before they had beaten, now they flogged twice as hard. Where before they had watched, now they prowled with paranoia. By night, they gathered in Charleston houses, 40 of them at one estate alone, laughing in drunken arrogance, boasting of their power. They were men who believed themselves untouchable, their authority backed by the law, the lash, and the noose. But fear is a strange thing. It breeds monsters not only in the hearts of masters but also in those of the enslaved. For among the kitchen servants, the field hands, and the house slaves who served wine at their feasts, a different kind of fire was taking root. The house slaves were in the closest proximity to power. They polished silver, tended lamps, and slept in small rooms just beyond the master's chambers. They were trusted enough to pour the overseers drinks, to bring them food, to stand silent in the corners of their laughter-filled nights. But trust is a fragile thing. When pressed by years of humiliation, by 1,000 small cuts of cruelty, it can turn into something sharper than steel. In Charleston, whispers carried like smoke. Stories of rebellion, of Hades' flames, of Vesey's vision, spread even as the authorities hanged conspirators in public squares. The lash could silence a scream, but it could not smother an idea. Among the enslaved, there lingered the possibility, fragile yet intoxicating, that justice could come not by prayer but by fire. It was in this atmosphere that the seeds of the macabre Charleston burning were planted. The city stood gilded but trembling, its overseers laughing too loud, its masters sleeping too easily, its enslaved holding back words that could kill them. Every night, lanterns flickered across Charleston's grand houses, and every night, one figure stood in silence among them. A house slave, nameless in the records, faceless in history, watched, waited, and endured. For him, survival was no longer enough. Each insult, each bruise, each night of forced servitude stacked like kindling in his heart. And in a city already on edge, all it would take was a single spark to ignite the unthinkable. Charleston, 1822, prosperous, proud, and perched on the edge of its own inferno. He was not born into silence, but Charleston had carved it into him. A house slave was expected to move like a shadow, always present, never heard. His steps were measured, his gaze lowered, his voice reserved for yes sir and no ma'am. His very existence depended on invisibility. And yet, it was from this invisibility that his strength would one day rise. Unlike the field hands, who toiled beneath the blistering sun and slept in the cramped quarters beyond the plantation walls, the house slave lived closer to the master's family. His duties seemed lighter to outsiders, tending the fire, pouring wine, polishing the silverware until it gleamed. But the proximity came at a cruel cost. He was forced to witness luxury at arm's length, Crystal goblets he would never drink from, roasted meats he could only smell, feather beds he could never lie in. Hunger, envy, and rage gnawed at him in silence. To the overseers he was little more than furniture, a moving fixture in their nightly rituals. They did not fear him. They hardly even saw him. When they spoke of punishments and executions, they did so freely as though he were deaf. When they stumbled drunk through the parlor, slurring orders, they trusted his hands to guide them without ever imagining those same hands might one day light a flame. His silence was his mask, but inside he remembered. He remembered the day he was torn from his mother's arms and sold into Charleston's slave market, the iron smell of chains heavy in the air. He remembered the overseer who whipped him bloody for spilling a cup of wine. He remembered the laughter of white men who wagered bets on how many lashes he could withstand before collapsing. These memories lived in his body like scars that never healed. And he remembered fire. As a child, he had watched cabins burn in the swamps after a punishment raid. He had seen how quickly the dry wood caught, how fast the flames spread, how screams became smoke. Fire was not just destruction, it was cleansing. It left no trace but ash. It turned masters and slaves alike into nothing but bone and soot. Now, as he poured brandy for the overseers and lit candles along the parlor walls, the thought returned to him. Fire was patient. Fire needed only a spark. Yet his face betrayed nothing. To the household he was obedient, steady-handed, efficient. He played the role they demanded. He bent when ordered to bend, bowed when ordered to bow. At night, in his narrow cot by the servants' quarters, he lay awake, listening to the laughter and drunken songs of the overseers echoing through the great house. He imagined their bodies sprawled across the floor, their voices choked in smoke. He imagined silence where once there had been cruelty. Charleston was trembling in 1822. Denmark Vesey's failed conspiracy had rattled every overseer, every master, every white family in the city. They whispered of uprisings, of Haiti's revolution, of slaves who had set fire to sugar fields and plantations. The authorities had executed dozens, hanging them as warnings in public squares. But the hangings had not stopped the whispers. If anything, they had made them stronger. And so, suspicion poisoned the air. Overseers carried pistols tucked into their belts even when drunk. Patrols prowled the streets after dark, watching for gatherings of slaves. Torture and interrogation became routine. But none of it touched the house slave who moved in silence through the grand halls. He was too useful, too trusted. They never imagined rebellion could bloom within the walls of their own home. Every night he studied them. 40 men boasting of their cruelty, proud of the lash. They trusted him to pour their drink, to light their tobacco, to fetch more wood for the fire. They grew careless in his presence, their arrogance blinding them to the truth, that he was no longer their servant, but their executioner in waiting. He began to watch the house itself. The dry wood of the beams, the curtains heavy with dust, the oil lamps perched too close to the walls. He learned how the wind moved through the rooms, how smoke would spread, where the exits could be blocked. Every detail was memorized in silence. His mind became a map of fire. At dawn, when the last overseer had fallen asleep in his chair, he would walk quietly through the smoldering embers of their hearts, staring into the ash. He would imagine the house consumed, the overseers trapped, their arrogance burned away. He would imagine himself free, even if only for a single night, as the flames devoured his chains. They thought him harmless. They thought him voiceless. But in his silence he carried centuries of rage. They were not masters, not planters, not men of refinement. The overseers were something else, hired teeth, gnashing for pay. Their purpose was simple, to keep the enslaved in line by any means necessary. Whip, chain, pistol, stake, the overseer was the hand of cruelty made flesh. And in Charleston, 1822, cruelty was not in short supply. There were 40 of them at this estate alone, men who lived by violence and laughed at suffering. They were not bound by gentility or manners. They drank deep, cursed loud, and made sport of their work. To the enslaved, they were nightmares in daylight, their very presence a promise of pain. Each had his own reputation. One prided himself on how many lashes he could deliver before a man fell unconscious. Another was known for breaking spirits by destroying families, selling children, punishing wives before husbands' eyes. There was one who carried a pistol at all times, not for defense, but to fire shots at random in the fields, watching men and women scatter like hunted animals. By day they were terrors. By night they became arrogant fools. Gathered together, their cruelty turned into camaraderie, their drunken laughter rolling through the great house like thunder. They told stories of whippings as if they were hunting tales. They bragged of the number of men they had broken. To them, Every scream was a trophy. They had grown careless. Fear had once made them vigilant. Fear of Denmark VC's rumored uprising, fear of 1,000 slaves rising at once. But the city's brutal crackdowns had emboldened them. They had watched the hangings, seen men swing from ropes, heard the crack of musket fire in Charleston squares. They believed the danger had passed. They believed they were untouchable. And so they drank. Every evening they filled the halls with smoke and noise, their boots clattering across the polished floors, their laughter shaking the rafters. They demanded music from the enslaved, clapping along to songs sung through clenched teeth. They spilled liquor on fine rugs, left bones and grease across tables meant for gentry. And always in the corner the house slave watched. To them he was invisible. They ordered him to refill their glasses, to clear their plates, to fetch more firewood, but they never looked into his eyes. They spoke openly before him, their voices thick with liquor, their words dripping with cruelty. They laughed about beatings as if they were children recalling games. They mocked the bodies of men who had collapsed under labor, joked about women they had taken by force. They were men without shame, and they believed themselves kings in a world built on pain. But arrogance is a kind of blindness. They did not see how many lamps they left burning, how close they placed their pipes to curtains, how they stumbled drunkenly into sleep with candles still lit. They did not notice the way the house slave lingered in the shadows, his eyes studying every flame. They did not realize that their laughter had become a kind of music that would soon be swallowed in fire. To the enslaved who served them, the overseers seemed like a wall of power, 40 men cruel and united. But in truth their strength was also their weakness. Gathered together in drunken stupor, they were vulnerable. They trusted their numbers, their pistols, their reputation for brutality. They never imagined that death could come quietly, softly, in the form of a servant with a torch. And so, night after night, the 40 overseers drank, laughed, and mocked the people whose labor kept them alive. They grew louder, crueler, more careless. They slept heavy with drink, their pistols lying unused on the floor. They believed themselves safe. But someone was watching. And someone was waiting. For every cruel laugh, every boast of violence, every careless flame they left behind, another ember was added to the fire growing inside the house slave. 40 men. 40 demons. 40 torches waiting to be lit. Their arrogance had sealed their fate. They were men who had built their lives on fire, burning backs, burning families, burning hope. And in Charleston, in that summer of fear and whispers, fire would come for them in return. And rage, like fire, needs only air to breathe. Charleston was already smoldering in 1822, even before the first torch was lit. The air was thick with suspicion, with rumors of rebellion whispered in kitchens, fields, and swamps. Denmark VC's name lingered like smoke, spoken cautiously, almost reverently, among the enslaved. His conspiracy, whether as vast as the authorities claimed or not, had struck terror into the white population. They imagined thousands of slaves rising in the night, blades drawn, torches blazing, Charleston reduced to cinders. For the overseers, VC's failed plot was both warning and justification. They tightened their whips. They barked orders with sharper cruelty. They patrolled with pistols drawn, suspicion dripping from their eyes. Yet the more they punished, the more they revealed their fear. Fear clung to them like sweat. They laughed louder at night to drown it out, but still they trembled in their sleep. Among the enslaved, VC's ghost lived on. The hangings had silenced his voice but not his vision. His rebellion had promised freedom, even if it had ended in blood. And in the quiet spaces of Charleston, the slave quarters, the stables, the kitchens, the promise still flickered. Whispers passed like sparks. It is not over. Another chance will come. Fire will come. The house slave heard these whispers. He carried them with him as he moved through the grand halls, refilling goblets, trimming wicks, stoking hearths. To the overseers he was silent, obedient. To the enslaved, he was one of them, bound by the same chains, breathing the same smoke of suffering. And deep within him VC's dream took root. But where VC had called for swords and muskets, the house slave thought of fire. He knew its language. He had seen how a stray spark could consume a cabin, how dry wood could turn into an inferno. Fire did not discriminate. It did not care for wealth or power. It reduced silk and rags alike to ash. To the enslaved it was terror. But to him it had become something else, justice. Night after night, as the overseers gathered in their drunken rituals, the house slave studied them. He watched how many lamps they lit, how often they left them burning into the night. He memorized the layout of the parlor, the position of the drapes, the flow of air through the hallways. He knew where the house would burn fastest, where smoke would spread first, where men would find themselves trapped before they even realized the danger. And all the while the whispers grew louder. Some said the city was cursed, that Charleston would one day drown in flames as punishment for its sins. Others spoke of Haiti, where slaves had risen with fire and steel, throwing off their chains in rivers of blood. Stories traveled faster than the patrols, faster than the hangman's rope. In every whisper the house slave heard a call: burn them, burn it all. But he was cautious. He could not confide in anyone, not even those who suffered beside him. The walls had ears, and betrayal was always a breath away. He carried his secret alone, wearing obedience like a mask. But inside the fire grew. He began to test the house. A candle placed too close to the curtain, how long before the fabric smoldered? A stray ember dropped in the ashes, how quickly would smoke rise? He learned with careful hands, never drawing suspicion, never letting his intent show. The overseers did not notice. They were too drunk, too arrogant, too blind to the servant in the shadows. And when he lay awake in his narrow cot at night, he whispered only to himself, "One spark. That is all it takes." The city outside echoed his thoughts. Patrols doubled, and masters muttered about uprisings. The fear of fire haunted them. They dreamed of torches in the night, of slaves with blades, of Charleston reduced to glowing embers. Fear had already half burned the city. The house slave would only finish the work. For he was no longer thinking of survival. Survival had been his whole life, silent, obedient, invisible. Now he thought of vengeance, of screams, of flames consuming the laughter of the overseers. He thought of justice, carried not by courts or laws but by smoke and ash. The whispers had become a roar inside him. And soon the fire would follow. The night began like so many others, thick with laughter, smoke, and arrogance. The overseers had gathered again, 40 men filling the grand house with the smell of roasted meat and spilled brandy. Outside, Charleston streets lay dark and uneasy, the whispers of rebellion still crawling through alleys and slave quarters. But inside these men felt untouchable. The walls, the pistols at their sides, and their sheer number convinced them that no force could harm them. They feasted as if the city itself were theirs to devour. Platters of pork and venison crowded the tables, bones piling high as they tore flesh with greasy hands. They drank deeply, their goblets sloshing over with strong liquor, their voices booming through the rafters. Laughter rolled like thunder, coarse and cruel, echoing down the hallways where enslaved servants stood silent in the shadows. The house slave moved among them, steady as ever. His face was calm, his steps measured. He carried trays of meat, pitchers of wine, basins of water for their filthy hands. They barely acknowledged him, save for the occasional barked command. To them he was invisible, just another shadow in the corner. But his eyes saw everything. The overseers' cruelty spilled from their mouths as easily as the drink. They boasted of whippings, mocking the screams of men in the fields. One bragged of branding a runaway with a heated iron. Another laughed about selling a mother away from her child, calling it discipline. Their words were daggers, their laughter the sound of demons at play. And yet, beneath the noise there was something else, something quieter, more sinister. The air in the house felt heavy, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The candle flames flickered, their shadows stretching across the floor like grasping hands. Smoke curled lazily above the fireplace, clinging to the beams like a warning that it was a feast, but it was also a funeral. They just didn't know it yet. The house slave poured wine into goblets, his hands steady even as his mind burned. He watched the overseers grow careless. One dropped his pistol to the floor, too drunk to care. Another leaned back in his chair, snoring even as meat dripped from his hand. Their boots clattered, their songs slurred, their arrogance blinding them to the truth, that death sat at the table with them. Every clang of a goblet was like a tolling bell. Every burst of laughter was a final breath. At one point, an overseer raised his glass and called for a toast. "To VC's bones," he shouted, his words thick with drink. "To every fool who thought they could rise against us. Let them hang and let us drink." The others roared with approval, slamming fists against the table. Brandy spilled across the wood, dripping onto the floorboards below. The house slave's eyes followed the liquid as it ran like a dark vein toward the fire's glow. He thought of how quickly it might catch, how fast the room might turn to flame. But still he waited. Patience was his weapon. The overseers grew louder, sloppier. They sang crude songs, their voices cracking. They brawled playfully, knocking over chairs, crashing into tables. They demanded more wine, more meat, more firewood. And always the house slave obeyed, his silence hiding the storm inside him. As the night stretched on, their feast grew grotesque. Bones scattered across the floor, gnawed clean. Candles burned low, their wax pooling like blood. The air thickened with smoke and sweat, the stench of drink and decay. Some of the men slumped in their chairs, drifting towards sleep. Others sprawled across the floor, their boots still muddy, their mouths open in drunken snores. It was then, in the thick silence between laughter and sleep, that the house slave felt the moment arrive. He looked at the room, at the 40 men sprawled in arrogance, at the candles trembling low, at the curtains swaying gently in the draught. He felt the weight of the whispers that had followed him for weeks. Fire will come. Fire will cleanse. Fire will free. This was their last supper. He moved quietly, gathering plates, refilling goblets no one would finish. His hands were steady, but his heart pounded like a drum in his chest. He looked at their faces, flushed with drink, slack with arrogance, oblivious to the fate that hovered above them like smoke. And then, as he passed by the great fireplace, he let his fingers brush the log pile stacked high with dry wood. He felt the heat against his skin, the flicker of flame licking at the edges. He imagined it spreading, leaping, devouring. Soon, he told himself. Very soon. The overseers dreamed in drunken sleep, their snores a chorus of ignorance. The house grew quieter, but the silence was not peace. It was the silence before a storm, before a match strikes, before a scream splits the night. The house slave retreated into the shadows, his eyes fixed on the flames. His patience had carried him this far. Now only one act remained. The overseers had feasted, laughed, and mocked the world. But their supper was done. Their plates were empty. Their laughter was ash. And soon so too would they be. The night of June 16, 1822, began like any other in Charleston, humid, heavy, and stifling with the scent of salt from the nearby harbor. Crickets sang in the marsh grass, and the overseers, drunk on rum and arrogance, drifted into restless slumber inside the long wooden barracks that had been built to house them. Their boots were scattered near the door, their whips hung on the walls like trophies. But within the shadows of the great house, Samuel moved with the silence of a man who no longer belonged to the world of the living. He carried in his hands a small bundle, cloth soaked in lamp oil, stolen from the very lanterns that once lit the overseer's way as they tormented him and his people. Each step he took seemed guided not by his own will, but by the whispered voices of those who had fallen, men, women, and children buried nameless in shallow graves on the plantation's edge. Samuel's heart did not race. His breath did not falter. It was as if the act he was about to commit had already been decided, centuries before he was born. He moved to the barracks, crouching low in the high grass. The overseers snored inside, some muttering in drunken sleep, their words a slurry of cruelty. Samuel pushed the soaked cloth beneath the doorframe, his hands trembling only once before he struck the flint. The spark caught like a predator's eye in the night, and the flames licked hungrily at the oil-soaked fibers. The wood groaned. The fire spread. At first it was a whisper, a flicker of light that danced like a forbidden secret. But soon it grew into a roar, orange and furious, curling up the walls and clawing at the roof beams. The overseers woke too late, their screams piercing the night as smoke poured into their lungs. Some tried to force the door open, but Samuel had barred it with an iron latch taken from the stables. Others hurled themselves against the shuttered windows, their fists bleeding, their faces pale with terror. The fire consumed them all. Charleston's night sky glowed red as if hell itself had risen to the surface. Witnesses claimed later that the blaze seemed unnatural, almost alive, curling and twisting in patterns that resembled faces. Some swore they saw the figures of enslaved men and women in the smoke, their arms reaching upward, as though reclaiming their vengeance from beyond the grave. Samuel stood at a distance, his face illuminated by the inferno. His expression was unreadable, not triumph, not sorrow, but something older, something elemental. The cries of the dying overseers echoed through the fields, but Samuel did not flinch. In that moment he was no longer just a house slave. He was a messenger. When the barracks finally collapsed, sending sparks into the sky like 1,000 fiery birds, the silence that followed was heavier than the screams had been. Every enslaved person who awoke to the glow in the distance understood without words what had happened. Some wept, some prayed, and some bowed their heads in solemn gratitude. The fire had spoken. And Charleston, though it did not yet know it, would never forget the night when 40 overseers burned in their sleep. At dawn, Charleston awoke to the scent of smoke drifting over the harbor, a foul mix of burned pine, scorched flesh, and ash. The city's rooftops glowed faintly from the reflection of the fire's dying embers, and the morning bells rang not for worship but for alarm. Word spread like a fever. The overseers are dead, all 40 of them burned alive in their sleep. The citizens gathered in the market square, whispering in tight circles, their faces pale with fear. Women clutched their children closer, while men gripped pistols and muskets, scanning the horizon as if expecting an invisible army to descend. Charleston had always feared rebellion. The city, built upon the backs of enslaved men and women, was itself a powder keg. The fire had been the spark. "They say it was no accident," muttered a merchant, his hands shaking as he adjusted his hat. "The fire was set. Deliberate." Others nodded, glancing over their shoulders at the groups of enslaved laborers being marched under watchful eyes back to their quarters. Suspicion thickened the air like smoke. Masters interrogated their slaves with threats, whips, and chains. Every whisper, every side glance, was now seen as a sign of conspiracy. And Samuel, though he had not yet been caught, was no longer a man, but a legend moving through the streets. Some enslaved whispered his name in awe, calling him deliverer. They believed the fire had been a holy act, a cleansing flame sent to weaken the oppressors. Others were terrified, knowing what Charleston would do when it learned the truth. For every overseer lost, vengeance would be taken 100-fold. By noon, Charleston was a city under siege, by its own terror. Militia patrols marched the cobbled streets, drums beating like war signals. Lanterns hung in broad daylight, ready to be lit should another fire erupt. The governor declared that any sign of rebellion would be met with immediate execution. Inside the church, ministers thundered from the pulpits. "This was the devil's work. The flames of hell have been set loose among us. We must root out the serpent, for it slithers in our very midst." But not everyone believed it was the devil. Some overseers' widows swore they saw a tall figure watching from the fields that night, his eyes glowing in the firelight, his body untouched by flame. They claimed it was no man at all, but a spirit of vengeance wearing human flesh. The city's leaders met in secret, drawing maps, listing names, questioning who among the enslaved had the intelligence and courage to commit such a bold act. The name Samuel surfaced more than once. By nightfall, Charleston was restless, trembling. Every candle that flickered too high, every puff of smoke rising from a chimney, sent households into panic. Men sat awake with muskets across their knees, while women prayed in hushed voices. And somewhere, hidden among the shadows of the city, Samuel listened to the chaos he had birthed. The fire had not ended with the overseer's screams, it had spread, invisible but consuming, into the hearts of Charleston itself. The people of the city now feared the very souls they had chained. And fear, Samuel knew, was the beginning of collapse. Charleston's cobbled streets rattled beneath the boots of armed patrols. Muskets gleamed in the sun, bayonets catching the light like the teeth of some great predator. The city had transformed overnight into a fortress of suspicion. Every alley watched, every whisper silenced with the crack of a whip. The hunt had begun. Authorities spread across the plantations, dragging men, women, and even children from their quarters. Questioning was not enough. Torment became their weapon. Bodies bore the marks of interrogation. Rope burns around wrists, bruises across backs, lips split open from fists demanding answers. Yet silence clung stubbornly to the enslaved. Some did not know Samuel's name. Others knew but would rather face the lash than betray him. Fear walked on both sides of the line. For the enslaved, it was the fear of discovery, of punishment, of being hanged for a crime they did not commit. For Charleston's rulers, it was the fear of shadows. Every face in the field looked like a conspirator. Every prayer uttered in the dark sounded like rebellion. Rumors multiplied faster than truth. Some claimed Samuel had fled to the swamps, where no white man dared to follow. Others whispered that he moved at night like a phantom, passing unseen through locked doors, his skin glowing with the heat of the fire that had claimed the overseers. Mothers hushed their children with warnings, "Be quiet or Samuel's flame will find you." The militia, desperate, offered rewards for information. Pamphlets were printed, nailed to tavern walls and church doors, declaring, "Wanted, the instigator of the great burning. The one called Samuel. Alive if possible. Dead if necessary." Yet with every day that passed, Samuel became less man and more myth. Overseers who rode into the fields swore they saw him at the edge of the horizon, watching, always watching, before fading into the mist. One soldier claimed that when he fired his musket at the figure, the bullet whistled through smoke and struck nothing. Still, Charleston's fury grew. Gallows were raised in the town square as a warning. Chains were tightened, patrols doubled, prayers turned into curses. The city fed itself on dread. But Samuel was not gone. He moved with care, slipping through abandoned barns, listening to the soldiers' drunken talk, memorizing patrol routes. By night, he returned to the quarters unseen, his presence whispered like a hymn. To the enslaved he was no longer simply Samuel, he was fire itself. He was proof that the oppressors could burn, that their power was not eternal. For Charleston's leaders, this truth was unbearable. The hunt did not stop at finding a man. It became an exorcism. They sought to erase his memory, to bury the very idea of Samuel beneath blood and fear. Yet the more they searched, the more they hanged innocents in his place, the more powerful his legend grew. By late summer, Samuel was no longer just one man hunted through Charleston streets and swamps. He was an idea, a terror, a whisper that spread like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to kill. And in their desperation to catch him, Charleston began to consume itself. By September of 1822, Charleston was a city choking on its own terror. The overseers' ashes had long cooled, yet the memory of their screams clung to every brick, every beam, every pew in the churches where men still shouted sermons of fear. The fire had ended, but its echo lived on. And so the city's rulers, desperate to prove their power unbroken, devised a trial, not of Samuel who still walked free in legend, but of those who bore his shadow. The courthouse was packed. Wealthy planters in fine coats filled the benches, their wives clutching lace handkerchiefs as if they might faint at the mere mention of fire. Soldiers lined the walls, muskets gleaming, their eyes hard. At the center, shackled and trembling, stood a row of enslaved men and women accused of conspiring with Samuel. Some were elderly, others scarcely more than boys. None had confessed. The judge's gavel struck like a pistol shot. "This city will not be undone by rebellion," he thundered. "The flames that consumed our brothers will not consume us. We will root out this evil." But the trial was never meant for truth. Witnesses were bribed, testimonies twisted. An overseer's widow swore she had seen one of the accused carrying a torch near the fields that night, though she had been miles away in her own home. Another planter claimed he overheard whispered prayers for Samuel's protection, though he could not recall when or where. The accused spoke little. Some lowered their eyes, others lifted their chins in defiance. When one young man declared, "We did nothing but dream of freedom," the courtroom erupted in rage. His words were taken not as a plea but as proof. Outside, crowds gathered, buzzing with morbid anticipation. Children climbed posts to see, merchants sold cups of cider, and preachers declared the spectacle divine justice. Yet among the enslaved who were forced to watch, a different kind of silence hung heavy, a silence that was not submission but mourning, and beneath mourning something harder. Something like fire waiting to be fed. Verdicts came swift. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Sentences were harsher still. Public hangings to be carried out at dawn. The judge spoke with finality, "Let these deaths remind every soul in Charleston that rebellion will be met not with mercy, but with the rope." When the condemned were led away, chains clanking, some wept, some prayed, and some sang low songs in voices cracked but unbroken. And as their voices drifted through the courthouse windows, men and women in the crowd shifted uneasily. It did not sound like defeat. It sounded like prophecy. That night, Samuel watched from the shadows at the edge of town. His face, lit only by the moon, bore no tears, no smile. He knew the noose would claim the innocent before it ever touched him. Yet he also knew something the rulers of Charleston could not see. Every innocent body swung by dawn would only feed the legend. The city believed it was destroying him. In truth, it was making him immortal. The morning of the hangings arrived heavy with mist, the kind that clung to skin like damp cloth and blurred the edges of the city. A gallows had been raised in the center of Charleston, its beams raw and pale against the gray sky. Ropes swung lazily in the breeze, waiting for their burden. Crowds gathered early, eager for a spectacle. Men stood stiff with muskets in hand, women with pale faces pressed kerchiefs to their lips, and children were hoisted onto shoulders to watch death in the square. The governor himself presided, seated beneath a white canopy as if attending a festival rather than an execution. The condemned were led out one by one, chains rattling. Some trembled, some wept, and some walked with a steadiness that unsettled even their captors. Their eyes met those in the crowd, not pleading but searching, as though asking who among them carried the faintest flicker of shame. A minister prayed loudly, condemning them as servants of Satan. But when the rope was placed around the first prisoner's neck, a sound rose that silenced even his sermon. It was singing. Low at first, almost a hum, but swelling until it filled the square. The voices of the condemned lifted into the air, cracked and weary yet strong enough to cut through the drums and the curses. They sang not of death, but of deliverance. Their words were not in English, but in the old tongue carried across the ocean, a hymn that the crowd could not understand but could not mistake: defiance. One by one the bodies dropped. The ropes snapped taut and the singing was broken, but not ended. For with each death, another voice carried it on, until the last prisoner swayed in silence, and still the hymn seemed to echo in the mist. The crowd dispersed, shaken though they would not admit it. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Planters barked orders with forced bravado. But in their hearts, they carried something they had not expected to find at the gallows: unease. Because the hangings had not killed the fire. That night, as Charleston slept, stories spread like sparks on the wind. Some swore they saw the faces of the hanged glowing faintly in the mist, their lips still moving in song. Others claimed that Samuel himself had walked among the crowd unseen, his eyes fixed not on the gallows, but on the governor beneath the white canopy. And Samuel, still free, still unbroken, watched the city sink deeper into its own fear. He did not celebrate, for celebration was too small a thing for what had begun. He only waited, knowing now that Charleston had sealed its own fate. The overseers were ash. The innocent were martyrs. And Samuel had become something more than a man. He was fire without smoke, flame without end. A story that mothers whispered to children, a name spoken both in fear and in prayer. Years would pass, but the memory of the Charleston burning would never fade. Even as buildings rose and streets changed, the city carried with it a scar. And in that scar Samuel lived on, forever hunted, forever feared, forever burning. For fire, once born, cannot be hanged. It waits. It spreads. Remembers.